This unit focuses on strategies for assessing artistic products and artistic performances, such as musical performances. One of the questions that often comes up is whether artistic products can really be assessed. And I would argue that there is really a need to assess them, particularly in educational circumstances. There is a need to be able to, while a student is receiving instruction, to be able to examine what progress a student has made, and to be able to diagnose strengths and weaknesses. We call that formative assessment because we're assessing instruction during the period of instruction. There are also times when we need to provide summative evaluations. These are typically educational transition times when one might be moving, let's say, from high school to the university, and we need to make judgments about students' work. They would also occur when one is making transitions from finishing one's education to moving to a professional circumstance. There's a need to make judgments about the quality of the work at the end, even at the end of the semester, one might argue, the need for summative evaluations. Typically, the way we judge artistic products or outcomes is to look at expert judgments. And usually we think about the notion of expert judgments is the idea that judges agree or there is a consensus about the artistic product. And the question is, can we be objective about artistry? And the issue is usually answered by measurement people by saying, if you have a consensus of experts or judges, then you've reached some kind of objectivity. You agree. And really, all objectivity is kind of an agreement. And there is a particular way that we measure this when we're looking at assessments, and one of the ways we do that is by looking at something called interjudge reliability. And it's really a question of how much do the judges agree about it gives us an index of how much judges agree about a particular artistic product. Often we use global judgments, which means we're simply looking at the work or listening to the work and making some general judgment about its quality. It's acceptable, it's not acceptable. The problem sometimes with global judgments is, well, what yardstick are we using? How are we making our judgment? What criteria are we using? And then there's the problem of different judges sometimes employing different criteria. So I may look for one thing. I may be really fascinated by color in an artwork, or by expression in a music performance, or maybe I'm looking for just simply rhythmic accuracy or whether in-tuneness in a music performance. If different judges are attending to different things, they may rate or evaluate the artistic product differently. We seem to all be able to agree on what's great works. The question is, in educational settings, we're not typically talking about great works, so we need to be able to make more refined judgments in the notion that making artistic judgments is part of education, part of the educative role. There are ways to improve global judgments, and that one way is by comparison, by comparing different works. That's more possible, for instance, in visual arts, where we can kind of put two paintings side by side and kind of go back and forth and make our decision. It's a little more difficult in the arts such as dance, theater, or music, the performing arts, where there's a temporal factor. That is, the performance happens, and then we can't bring it back to compare. Within we're talking essentially about making judgments about what researchers call the psychomotor domain. It has to do with kind of physical activities. And in this particular psychomotor domain, which the domains, there are others for cognitive and affective behavior, they help us structure and understand what aspect we're looking at. So in the psychomotor domain, we could argue that it moves from more simple physical behavior to more complex physical behavior. And if you look at these four levels, observing, imitating, practicing, and adapting, you can see that we moved from, what a music learner might do. from first observing a behavior to then kind of imitating what the teacher models, to then refining that through physical practice, and then eventually kind of fine-tuning, making those adjustments that make the work artistic rather than simply a rendition of the music. Checklists are particularly useful at the lower levels of artistic behavior, meaning we're looking at simply the presence or absence of a particular behavior. So these would more likely be used at formative stages. Is the student holding the instrument correctly? Yes, no. Does the student understand the function of the different mechanisms on a camera? Yes, no. The advantage is that to the teacher and to the student is that they encourage systematic observation, so that, again, kind of as a diagnostic tool. They're pretty simple to score, and they can provide students with feedback or information. They don't have any qualitative judgment, so we don't know, we're not talking about how good a student holds the instrument, but simply whether they're holding the instrument correctly. So it's a bimodal kind of decision. And it typically would not be good for refined levels of artistry, not for the higher levels in the taxonomy we just looked at. Typically, when one was designing a checklist, one would group terms in close proximity to each other. So we would look, if we're looking at beginning violin performance, we would maybe have a group of terms that referred to holding the bow, and another group that we looked at left hand position. They would be simply brief descriptions, and they would be arranged in some kind of logical order. They're used for formative assessment, and they might be good for weekly record keeping, as in the traditional weekly music lesson. Ranking is another strategy. You know, this is often done in art shows where we look at the work and we award a first prize, a second prize, or third prize. And sometimes this is done in musical situations also. It gets more complex or becomes difficult when there are a large number of things to be ranked. Because, how does, if we're ranking 1 through 10, that's much more complicated than awarding a first, second, and third prize. It's also complicated by the temporal nature of performing arts, such as music. So when we hear something, then it's gone, and to retain that and to compare it to something we're hearing now becomes more difficult. There is a strategy called paired comparison where we pair each performance with each other. So if we have 4 performances, we might first compare 1 and 2, and then 2 and 3, and then 1 and 4, and 2 and 4, all possible pairs. But the problem is that to do that, as soon as if we have 10 items that we're pairing together, there generates to be 45 pairs. So that becomes complex in terms of a larger number of items to evaluate. And again, the temporal nature is problematic. It does produce a very reliable result, though, a very consistent. In other words, judges really agree when they use this kind of approach. Traditionally, the strategy that is often used are rating scales. And here's typically when we have a category or a statement and we make a judgment with certain kinds of, with certain kind of response scale. Sometimes, typically the response scale, and they're called Likert type rating scales, is something like strongly agree to strongly disagree, often with 5, options. It can be also represented graphically, where one might then put a X somewhere along a line. Sometimes graphic scales have just a bipolar, which is never and always, rather than even having some words in the middle. And then you just mark on the graph on the line where that is. More traditionally, though, the Likert type scales are used. You can have multiple continuums. That is, you can make judgments you can have multiple Likert type scales. Sometimes there are just 5 scales, and other times there are multiple scales. Often it's recommended that the more scales there are, the more reliable or the more consistent judges will be. So the more categories, the more precise. Partially that is because it generates a large number of of judgments, and the score range is relatively large. So if you have like a 5-option Likert type scale, and you have, let's say you have 30 descriptors that you're rating, well, the highest score then would be 5 times 30, or 150, and the lowest score would be 5 times 1, assuming 1 is the lowest score one could get on each of these categories, or the lowest score would be then 30. So there's a 120-point range, which would increase the reliability of the judges. They simply have descriptive, Likert scales typically have descriptive statements. One can use different numbers of responses. If a child was filling it out, a young reader, let's say, we would often use only 3 responses. And usually beyond 7, there's a amount of diminishing return. So somewhere between 5, 6, or 7 is often what adult judges would use. If one uses a even number, then one leaves the option of kind of having forcing the judge to make a positive or negative decision. If one uses an odd number, then there's a middle point which is available to the judge. The more possible scores, the more variability. So like if you have a 7-point scale, obviously, and there are 30 statements, now we have 210 as the highest score. What we try to do is identify multiple components of the performance or artistic product, multiple dimensions, and then rate each of those. And it does provide for systematic evaluation of complex behaviors. Here are some examples of some Likert type rating scales for different categories, and these are based on research that are done by Zadinsky, Burgi, and Cooksey. You can see one in the case of string performance, one in the case of euphonium or tuba performance, and one in this case of high school choral music. So these are statements that are descriptive of the performance, and on each statement one would have a response scale, probably strongly agree to strongly disagree, if that the performance is characterized by this statement. Here are some other ones, high school band, and Rob Horowitz in a dissertation done at Teachers College on jazz guitar improvisation. Here is an example of a project that was done in this class. I think it's on piano performance. And you can see again the qualities, and this gives you an idea of what the scale might look like, where we have highly disagree to highly agree that this statement is characteristic of the performance. So, for instance, produced a harsh tone. So, was the performance you're listening to, was it characterized by that? In which case, you'd highly agree, or was it? And that's a negative statement too. You should note that typically positive and negative statements are included on Likert type scales, and on these kinds of performance evaluations. So you can see it's a mix. Also, there are probably categories in here. Some do with physical, some to do with interpretation, and they're randomly included in here. So there might be 5 categories. I think one must be something about the physical. If you'll notice the last item on the page, inhibited by poor posture. So there must be some physical kinds of categories, and then there look like there are some interpretive categories. So there may be 5 statements. You know, it would be typical in a 30-item scale maybe to have 5 categories and maybe 5 or 6 statements for each category, both positive and negative. Another example of the same scale. Looks like it continues some different items. No, I guess the same items. There are some standardized music performance assessments, published tests. The Watkins-Farnham performance test is actually based on a dissertation that was done at Teachers College in the 40s. And what it does is it provides increasingly difficult sight reading examples. There are 30 of them in all. And the way it's scored is the way a student begins at the beginning and plays until they make more than 2 mistakes in the example. And that's where you end, let's say on example number 22, then that's your score. Farnham developed, after the Watkins-Farnham test, which was for band instruments, a later version called for just string instruments. And then finally, we also might consider the state adjudication forms published by many states that are used in a sense in standardized ways to evaluate typically all state or festival participants. Here's an example of the NISMA sight reading criteria or form for voice. You can get a sense, if you look carefully at it, the different levels and the different kind of difficulty level where the rhythms and the pitches, the number of pitches become more complex as we get to the higher, from level 1, Roman numeral 1 to Roman numeral 6. And then there are 2 examples presented. One which at level 3, one can see is a more simple sight reading example than at level 6, which is more complex. You might test yourself on this. There are some challenges when judges rate performances. Judges themselves are part of the, could affect the error in the assessment. For instance, there's the notion of the halo effect, where I know this student generally does well in other subject areas, so I generalize that to the student's performances. It's something within the individual in the sense that I know that they're characterized, they generally are a good student. They dress well, they speak well, they do well in their academic courses. So therefore I have a bias that they're going to do well in this performance. They present themselves on stage well. And so I'm biased about their performance. That's called a halo effect. They're generally a good person, so then they're going to be a good person in all things. There's also something called generosity errors, which can be high or low. That is, I'm a judge who I think everybody is wonderful, and so therefore I give everybody an A. Or I'm a judge who says, you know, nobody is as good as I am, so everybody gets a low grade. And that's, you know, interesting in a jury situation where then you might compare judges and, you know, judges' score, and how do you resolve those notions? There's also a logical, there's something also called a logical error, which is when we make a generalization across individuals that is rather than within individuals as the halo effect. The logical error would say, like, look, if Johnny does better in academic courses than Jane does, then Johnny will be a better performer than Jane will be. So it's kind of rather than within individual, it's across individuals. You know, Jane is an A student, therefore, and Sam is generally a B student. So therefore, Jane will always perform better than Sam. And so that's kind of a bias that's built in a judge. These are all characteristics of judges rather than the actual performance which is being judged. Rating scales can be used to rate a variety of behavior. I published something in 1973 which evaluated which assessed junior high school clarinetists. They can be used to evaluate courses. Many times you fill out course evaluations which use Likert type scales and have statements like the teacher turns back our papers in a timely manner. In 1975, I published an article that evaluated applied faculty members using a Likert type scale. Looked at character statements that students had made about performance faculty, like he always knows from week to week, or he or she always knows from week to week what I'm practicing, or he or she has a great knowledge of the field. There are also rating scales that have been used to evaluate student teachers. So a variety of rating scales can be used to evaluate or to assess a variety of complex psychomotor behaviors. They can also be used, as I hope I've shown today, to evaluate or assess artistic products. More recently, teachers have begun to use something we might consider scoring rubrics rather than rating scales. And here you can see the different categories that might be characteristic of a musical performances and different levels described more carefully in a sense. So we can look at the tone is consistently focused as a good characteristic, and the tone is not often focused as a bad characteristic. And you can look at these and see the different levels, each one described. So a little different approach than rating scales. So I hope you've gotten something out of this and have some better sense about how to judge performances.